Nice to see you all. It's 4 o'clock. It's a Saturday afternoon. We're all here to study the book of Luke as we continue, continue our journey through Luke's writings. A few things that we'd like to do before we get started. The first one is just to remind ourselves that if we like to talk a lot, there's some people who take a little bit longer to formulate their sentences and their thoughts. We'd like to make sure that everyone who wants to participate has a chance to share. So we like to keep that in mind. We also like to remind ourselves and also the people that might be watching either right now on YouTube or Facebook Live or somewhere down the road that we're all, including them, we're all from different backgrounds. We have different experiences. Some people have been Christians a long time, some for just a short time, some maybe not at all. And we can learn from each other as we learn more about God. We also like to start with a word of prayer. So I invite you to join me. Dear Lord, as we start our Bible study today, I just want to thank you for this opportunity to get together and for the technology to do it, Lord. And I just ask you to be with our conversation, be with our leader, Justin, today. Just help us to take something away from the study today that we can apply to our own lives as individuals, Lord, and maybe as collectively as a group as well. Thank you for your blessings. Please send your Holy Spirit now. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you. And those of you watching online, we'd like to hear from you for our kickoff. When was a time you were lost? When was a time you were lost? Anyone? Phyllis.
I remember one time when we were lost in the car when we first started having the map guidance automatically. It just took us into a complete dead end out in the middle of kind of nowhere. So we were trusting something to guide us that wasn't quite right.
So how'd you get out of it?
I think we just turned around and tried to backtrack to a place that we knew, because there was no other way to go. It was a dead end. We had to turn around at least, but we just tried to backtrack out. But on along another line, I have that dream a lot, a dream that I'm lost in my own hometown, walking. I don't know why, but over and over downtown Louisville.
Maybe it's telling you to move back. Anyone else? When was the time you were lost?
I got off a path once on what should have been a simple hike. And this was I shared a sermon once about a hike where I missed a sign and kind of got a little further. This was a different time on a different hike. And it was, populated and whatnot, but I got off the path somehow and I don't know how. And I ended up kind of in this little spot where the two sides of the hill came down. And I ended up in there. And then, but I knew the path was somewhere over here. And then I heard people and I was embarrassed. So I actually just stopped what I was doing and I got down behind a tree so that if they could see me, like I was hiding from them because it seemed like such a stupid thing because the path was really obvious. I don't know what happened. And eventually, I kind of kept going and ended up back on the path, but I was embarrassed enough to not admit that I was lost. And so I hid.
Hid? You said you hid?
I hid behind a tree. Because I didn't want to admit it. It was the Hyde Park Circle hike. So for context,
okay.
It should have been very obvious.
Sarah.
This was in Chicago a long, long time ago. I got on one of the buses and I thought I was going the right direction, but obviously I wasn't. And I kept looking and then there were places that I didn't recognize. And I'm like, where am I? So I'm like, okay, I think I'm going the wrong way. I need to get off this bus and turn around and go the other way. So that's what I did. And I got home and my parents were panicked. They're like, oh my God, you thought we were, you were kidnapped or you ran away from home. I'm like, I'm fine. I just got a little bit turned around. I'm fine.
It's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Aaron.
I got lost. I think it might have been the first time I was coming to Bradenton to pick Pi up because his truck, I think, was broken or something. And so I went to pick him up for Bible study, and I got confused because of the names of the streets, like their numbers, and some of them are like east and some of them are west. And so I was on the like west, the one that ended in west. No, east. I was on the one that ended in east, and I was supposed to be on one of the ended in west. It's the same number. And so he called me and he was like, "Where are you? You should be here by now." And I was like, "I'm on the street, you know." And then he's like, "That's not the right one. You have to be on the one that ends in west." And I'm like, "Oh, oh, hold on. Somebody's coming. Like they're stopping." Like, cause I had stopped like in the little like there was like a spot that had lines. And so I just stopped in there like with my flashers on or whatever. And so somebody pulled over and they're like, "Are you all right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm just not sure where I'm going. Like I need this street." And they're like, "Follow me." And he's like, "What are you doing?" Because like he was on the phone still with me. And I'm like, "I'm following this lady. She's gonna take me." And he's like, "No." He's like, "What are you doing? Like, don't follow them." He's like, "You don't know them." And I'm like, "It's fine." And I was like already following him. He's like, "Turn off now." He's like, "Turn off the street, that's right there or whatever." Because I told him what street it was. And I'm like, "But then she's gonna wonder what happened to me." And he's like, "Who cares?" He's like, "Stop following her." And I was like, "Okay." And so then he directed me to like his house. But it was so funny because I was just like gonna follow this random person like and trust them. But he was like, "Do not trust them." He's like, "Listen to me." And so I was lost at first, but then I wasn't lost anymore because he directed me to
Good.
yeah.
There's probably a middle ground in there somewhere of
Yeah.
not wholeheartedly trusting strangers, but also not being super cynical of every stranger either. Anybody else? That was a great story. Time you were lost. All right. So it's great. We had some people who turned around, get back on track. Some people did not want to ask directions because they were embarrassed or something. Other people did ask directions. Some people followed a stranger. Lots of different ways people tried to get back on track in their stories. This was great. Actually, there were a bunch of follow-up questions. I didn't have to ask any of them because your stories had so much variety. And it was great illustration. So we're going to be looking at a story today that, while it might not appear to be about getting lost initially and getting back on track, it's really an illustration of what happens if we don't ask for directions, if we don't stop and we don't reconsider things, that we can end up gravely lost. And it's okay to ask for directions. It's okay to turn around. So we're going to look at that today. Luke chapter 20, verses 9 through 19 is where we are. Luke 20, 9 through 19. All right. Yeah, I was trying to see. Let's just have one person read this. Straightforward, single story here. Who would read chapter 20, verses 9 through 19?
I'll do it.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, I'm reading in the New International Version today. And it reads, Parable of the Tenants. He went on to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that one also they beat and treated shamefully and sent away empty-handed. He sent still a third, and they wounded him and threw him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my son, whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. "This is the heir," they said. "Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When the people heard this, they said, "God forbid." Jesus looked directly at them and said, "Then what is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed." The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately, because they knew he had spoken this parable against them, but they were afraid of the people.
Thank you for that, Sarah. So this is a continuation. Anyone want to give me a recap of some of the things we've been looking at recently? In your own words.
Well, last week we looked at the temple and how Jesus accused them of using the temple for not so good things. And he drove out. He actually got rid of told them all to leave.
Mm-hmm. Anyone have anything else to add? Phyllis?
Well, he has already come into Jerusalem for the last time. This is his the time that his life is going to be ended. So I think things are kind of ratcheted up a little bit as far as the severity, the importance at this point. But and so like he shows his anger in the temple, and then his authority is questioned. They're saying, "So who do you think you are?" In short. And then this is how he answers that question: who, by what authority? And then he goes into this parable.
Yeah. Good. Thank you both for that. So this is a parable, as has been mentioned. We've looked at a fair amount of parables, so this shouldn't be a new thing for us. A parable illustrates the truth. It is not the truth itself. We always want to find out what the key lesson is in the parable. And sometimes we can find metaphors or parallels that maybe aren't the key lesson. It doesn't mean that they're not true or relevant, but maybe weren't the purpose for why Jesus told the parable. So sometimes some people like to notice interesting little different things. So in order to find the key thought or lesson, what are some things we have to consider whenever looking at a parable? How do you arrive at what the key lesson is when you look at a parable? We talked about a few things over the past few weeks.
You have to look at the characters, who the primary characters are
So like in the story,
in the story, in the
Yep.
parable. Yeah.
characters or things,
Right.
right? Because sometimes they're not always like people.
People. Yeah.
Anyone else? How do you find the key lesson to a parable when you look at it?
To piggyback on that, also the context in which the parable is being told, maybe who the audience is, who is Jesus telling us to?
That's probably the biggest one. That's a huge one. Because if we take a lot of parables, because they're metaphors, basically, they're literary devices in a way. If you don't have the context, you could be like, oh yeah, well, like, do you remember there was a parable we looked at recently, and kind of everyone's like natural tendency was to be like, well, the Father would be God, because we're used to always thinking of the Father in parables, but in that case, it was not. Like, that actually would have created some theological challenges. And so understanding the context is really important. What was happening? Parables in the Bible, at least, are always like Jesus speaking and him telling these stories, these illustrations. So what was happening when he tells the story? Was there something he was teaching or doing that he tells the story? Was there a rebuttal, like the Good Samaritan, right? That's a response to a question from someone. So if we don't know the question and we don't understand the dialogue that happens beforehand, then we wouldn't really fully understand what Jesus is saying in the parable. So context is really important. In some cases, Jesus will explain the parable and go through it. That happens with the sower, right? The seed that falls on the path, and some falls off the path on the rocky way, and some is eaten by the birds. So then the disciples are like, we don't know what that means. So then he explains, like, well, so the seeds that fall on this part mean this. And so sometimes he will actually explain them, and that's recorded in scripture. So context is a really big one. So who the characters are, what is the context? Anything else you guys use when you're trying to decipher parables? Phyllis.
I think sometimes comparing it to other things in the Bible that are similar or that have some connection. Prophecy, maybe, or other kinds of connections.
Right. That's a good one. Anyone else? Anything else? All right. So, does anyone know what the key lesson of this parable is before we dissect it? Or shall we dissect first?
Let's dissect.
Okay. So we always like to start and say, what do the characters represent? In this case, they're actual, there's a vineyard, but in general, this parable is mostly about individuals. So tell me a character. Who's a character in this parable?
Man who planted the vineyard.
All right. Who owns it? The owner. Owner of the vineyard. Anyone want to take a stab at who that represents?
God the Father.
Okay.
I agree.
All right. Why do you think that?
Because, from the rest of the story, because he's the creator of the world. Like he made the world, owns the world, and he has a son. So, and the owner has a son in the story. So I'm thinking it's the Father.
Okay. Yeah, that's where sometimes they go hand in hand. Like, it sounds like you kind of have an idea of the key lesson of this parable, and that's informing your understanding of who the characters are. And that happens sometimes. Like we arrive at the key lesson based on context or based on, there's some poignant things that Jesus says at the end of this in his dialogue with the Jewish leaders. And that really informs like what this parable is saying and what it's about. And so therefore we can further deduce with some confidence that the vineyard owner is probably God the Father. Creator is a good thing. That's to recognize. I like that. He actually is like making something, but also that God owns the universe, right? And the earth. He created the earth. So, and he's the owner of that vineyard. All right. Who's another character in this story?
The vine growers, I forget what, I liked how
The
Sarah.
Tenants.
Tenants, thank you.
The tenants or the farmers,
People who rented the land.
right? They don't own it. They've been entrusted to take care of it. So they will get some sort of profit from it some way. That happens still today. People own land. Maybe they don't want to farm it at all, or they don't want to farm all of it. So they will lease it out to other farmers for farming. But they still own it. Those arrangements are always worked out like in their contracts and things. So we have the tenant farmers. Who do they represent? You want to take a stab at that, Laura?
So knowing what I know, I think it is representing Israel or the Jews of the day.
Okay.
That's my stab.
All right. Phyllis?
Yeah, I would agree. And maybe specifically the leaders, the tenants are the ones that are representing who's there. So maybe the specific leaders are the actual tenant themselves.
Mhm.
But yes, I agree, Israel for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we see that. Where is it? When the scribes and chief priests realized that he had told this parable against them.
Mhm.
So that informs us a bit on that, right? Because the antagonist, if you will, are the tenant farmers. They're the bad guys in this story. So that seems like a plausible explanation. There's another character in this story.
How about the servants that the owners keep sending out?
Right. Who does that represent?
Prophet.
Prophets. John the Baptist, other people.
Isaiah, maybe Jeremiah,
Ezekiel.
and
Yeah,
Amos,
all the other prophets.
Yeah.
all the prophets.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Another character?
The Christ.
So who's the character?
Jesus. The character is a son.
There we go. The son of the owner, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And James has told us he believes this represents Jesus.
I agree.
Laura agrees. Aaron agrees. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So we have a story now where it sounds like God the Father plants a vineyard. The religious leaders of Jesus' day, and not just of his day, are tending to this vineyard. And he sends prophets, and they kill the prophets. And so then he sends his own son, and they kill his son. This is not the most difficult parable to interpret, is it? The situation that has been brewing for quite some time in this final journey to Jerusalem that Jesus was making, where he is increasingly confronted by Jewish leadership and increasingly is now like becoming increasingly bold in his own responses to them, which, we see kind of culminating in the cleansing of the temple the second time. And this affront to and this not shying away from declaring that he is the Messiah, and this rejection of that and these plots to kill and all of these things are all happening. So this is the context of what's been leading up to this and what happens shortly thereafter makes this a fairly easy parable to explain and to understand what it means. Some are not as easy, as we've discovered in recent weeks. But great job, everyone. So let's talk about the cornerstone. What does the cornerstone represent in this story that Jesus tells? The cornerstone is not actually part of the story, is it? It's like a little add-on thing.
And it looks like it's a quoted reference from something else
Aha.
in my Bible. Take my glasses off so I can see.
Phyllis?
Well, I think it's kind of another mini parable within as well. It's like this, the builders, the stone which the builders rejected, or the chief cornerstone, everything is built according to where that is placed. So, I mean, that's the first stone, if you will, if you're building a house, to my understanding. So it's like without that stone, everything crumbles. And so I think that that's also part of the message here, in addition to where that came from. I don't know where it came from, but
Psalm 118, verse 22.
there you go.
There we go. Yeah. Somebody want to read that? I love this. You guys this is our third week in a row. We're using the cross reference in our Bibles.
We're cross-referencing it up. I have it.
Thank you.
All right. Psalm 118:22. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Direct quote.
Direct quote. All right. Good. We'll come back to that more in a moment. So now let's work our way through this passage somewhat chronologically. Is there anything significant that you can think of about the three servants that the vineyard owner sent out before his son? Sarah and James have told us that that represents the prophets. Is there significance in that? What do you think, Aaron?
The first one, it says that they should give him of the fruit of the vineyard. So they were supposed to give him rent, I guess. I don't know. But they beat him and sent him away. So I don't know if that's like represents somebody or tithe. I don't know.
Yeah. So I mean, part of this agreement is like, okay, the harvest is coming. So, here, let's figure out like how much of that is your profits and how much of that, I mean, he's the owner of the land. That's rent. You could call that rent. Right. But then, that seems that there's supposed to be a share that the tenant farmers would get. I mean, they did the work. So, this is not an unusual arrangement. Doesn't seem like in any way. But yeah, so the first one is beat up and sent away without any of the money. And the second one, same thing.
Yep.
And the third one.
Mhm.
Thing.
So yeah, so Aaron is wondering if it represented any of them specifically.
Who's them?
Prophets.
I don't think so. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Let's look at Luke 13:34 though, just to see something Jesus has said a little earlier. Somebody want to read Luke 13:34 for us?
I have it. Or go ahead. Whoever wants to read it.
Go ahead, Phyllis.
I forgot now.
Luke 13:34.
13:34. Okay. I'm reading from the New King James Version. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing.
Thank you. That's pretty a strong statement. That's the words of Jesus. Several chapters earlier here in the book of Luke. And yeah, so that supports this idea. I mean, we know that, I think most people agree that like Jeremiah was like, wasn't he in like a cage, like a suspended jail cell of some sort for a while? And other prophets, of course, were ignored. And I feel like there's something about Elijah in this regard too, that wasn't part of the whole thing with Elijah being called by God and taken care of by ravens because there were no other, the others had all been rejected or killed. The others had all been killed. And so he kept Elijah safe in the forest. And then also with the widow of Zarephath, is that right?
I think so.
Who provided food and for him even in the midst of the famine until the Mount Carmel incident is then when God asked Elijah to make a public appearance. It kind of explains also why Elijah was running afterward. I mean, Jezebel's a very scary person and ruler in general, if you read about her, but also if the whole point in you being in exile in the forest and then sheltered away in this home with this widow and her boy is because they were killing prophets, and then you make a public appearance, and then Queen Jezebel says, I'm going to kill him. Like, you can kind of, it's not like it was a new concept, like probably was concerned about that from the beginning. So of course he has to, we see Elijah learning how to trust in God in that story, and I'm getting a little off track here, but point being that he probably, wasn't terribly surprised when he heard that she was wanting to kill him. That's probably, because that's kind of the world he'd been living in for some time. So prophets in general had been killed. In that case, of course, Jezebel is not a Jew, not part of Israel. But there were prophets that came later that the Jewish leaders did not accept and rejected what they had to say. So strong words here by Jesus, and definitely quite offensive to the chief priests and the scribes that he's speaking to. Let's go on. Let's look at verse 16. We're going to start getting into this other thing that we've already referenced. Somebody want to read 16? Actually, let's read 16 and 17 together, and then we'll work our way through both of those verses. Somebody want to read verse 16 again? 16 and 17, sorry. Thanks, Aaron.
Sorry, I almost fell. Let's see. 16 and 17. He shall come and destroy these husbandmen, and shall give the vineyard to others. And when they heard it, they said, God forbid. And he beheld them and said, what is this then that is written? The stone which the builders rejected, the same has become the head of the corner.
All right. So verse 16. What do you think is the real message here? Or the deeper message, if there's kind of layers? Tell me your thoughts about verse 16 and what it means.
I'll take a go at it. I think it means that what the Jewish leaders and the Jewish nation has, the truth that they have, it's not going to be theirs anymore. It's going to be, they had their chance with it. they weren't spreading it. It wasn't they weren't sharing it as it should be and living the life that they should be. So they were going to take it, and God was going to take it and give it to someone else and let them have a chance to make it flourish and share. So when it says to others, I see that others as being the Gentiles.
Mm.
Mm.
Thanks for that, Laura. Aaron.
Reading verse 16 makes me think of stewardship, like things are entrusted to us, and the vineyard was entrusted to certain people, and when they didn't fulfill their that trust, like they didn't treat it right, I guess, or I'm not sure the word I'm trying to think of, but then it can, so it's not like it's not an entitlement, like it's a privilege to have like the vineyard and to like be trustworthy with it, I guess. So like we need to be, if we're entrusted with something by God, then we need to be good stewards of that and not like I guess betray that trust.
Mm. Yeah. I like that. I like that perspective. That that seems to be the big gap here in this whole issue of Israel rejecting Jesus, and the hardening of the hearts of the leaders. I mean, obviously each individual makes a choice for themselves, but there's also something that's happening collectively here that I think we can find its roots in this idea that Judaism of the day had, for some time, decades, if not centuries, assigned itself to the view that they were a superior nation. And that somehow God's special favor and entrusting, and I don't know what word to use, entrustment or something that he had put on Israel, that somehow that warranted a type of exclusivity. That because these sheep herders came into Canaan and destroyed mighty warriors and giants, because they were given a land with little to no bloodshed and all of these things, that they were led through the wilderness with this pillar of fire and cloud of light, that somehow that, which was of course supposed to be a remembrance of God's providence and power and majesty, but turned into we're better. And the reason God's behind us is because we're better. And that shift in perspective turns deadly eventually, because it's the antithesis of who God actually is, which, I always have said to people that, I'm much more comfortable around secularists than, a person of faith who has it wrong. And I don't mean we all have something wrong, but I mean has it wrong, is acting, is using faith as a premise for things of the devil, ego, pride, greed, all of these other things. That's, to me, that's deadlier than someone who doesn't ascribe to know God exists or think God exists, or maybe he does exist, but doesn't ascribe to follow God. The person who says they follow God, but actually are following themselves, to me, that's a more concerning situation. And I think that's ultimately what happens here with Israel, right? That they have bought into this mindset of exclusivity, of superiority, of God's chosen people, and that just makes them a superior race. And I think ultimately that leads us to where we arrive here in Luke chapter 20 with some of these interactions. Phyllis.
Well, I agree, and I think that idea that they're superior or prideful makes them unapproachable. They're not going to, for the most part, they won't listen then if they think that they've already got everything, which they do. And I think that even the verse that we went back and read in another part, I forgot where it was, but it was about, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how long I would have longed to, cared for you. But when it says, like, I would have gathered you under like a hen and her chicks, well, a hen will gather, she'll put her wings around every single chick, no matter what. I mean, she doesn't pick and choose, And I think that he's even kind of saying, like, if they would have humbled themselves, that he would have wanted to have gathered them with everybody, and they just didn't want to think that they needed to be. So,
Yeah, I think so. Because if you think that your faith makes you better than others, not like makes you better as in helps you be a better person. And let's define that for a moment too, right? Like the transformative power of the Spirit, being a better person, being better because of God's presence means that I'm going to care less about myself. So there is this kind of like contradiction that exists, recognizing the idea of the need to be better and the desire to be better. At the same time, to be better means to actually recognize how good we aren't, right? There's like this, that's actually being better and becoming a better person, more like, when we have Christ in our lives, that's what happens. So if we buy into this idea of that we are just innately better because of our faith, because of our beliefs, well, then first of all, it's very hard to like build trust with anybody who's not in your group. I mean, when was the last time you were just like so attracted to be around somebody who was just telling you like how much better they were than you and how you would never be that way and you're never going to be that, right? Like, I mean, it's an incredibly obnoxious environment. We've all been around somebody like this at some point. We may have been that person at some point too. Let's not forget that either. But like, it's an obnoxious environment to be in, right? So it's not a very beneficial evangelistic tool. It's also the antithesis of Jesus. We've been looking at so much of Jesus' life here through the book of Luke, and we don't see any of that. We're only just now starting to see him be a little more assertive in declaring who he is and what he's here for. I mean, people don't like to use the word passive with Jesus, but there's a certain passivity. It doesn't mean that he's passive in his heart, but like he's quiet. He just doesn't say stuff sometimes, or he deflects because that's just not the battle to fight at that moment. And I think there's a lesson in that. James.
Hi, I started to say something and then I forgot what it was.
Oh no. I need to come to you quickly. When I see your hand
Yeah,
next time,
maybe it'll come back to me. I'll raise my hand again.
All right. I'll let you butt right in when that happens. Interject. So, this idea that if we think we're better, well, then when Jesus, if we were in the Jewish leaders' shoes, there comes a point where then that we start to like intertwine things. So we start to take that mindset and that concept, which came from a place of like God's chosen people, and it starts to wind itself around threads of power and authority and influence. And then you start realizing you have a certain amount of stability in your life because of these things. So now there's a cultural component all of a sudden. So now you're used to a certain lifestyle, used to wearing, I mean, these guys that are confronting Jesus are in very elaborate robes, very expensive clothing, that the other people around are not. You start to get very comfortable in that. You do start to feel that that you're there because you're good, because you're amazing. And so and other people aren't there because they're just not as amazing. And there starts to become this kind of like pity kind of thing that happens. These are like things that don't happen overnight. These are things that like slowly, like all this, our heart, our mindset shifts and shifts, and sometimes over generations, but even within our own lifetime can shift and shift to where it comes to a point where we can't imagine our life not like that. So then this guy, Jesus, shows up and he says that you should be like selling those fine clothes and giving them to the poor. He says that your position of power doesn't matter. The first will be last and the last will be first. He says that you're actually not that important. He says that that the very thing that you think that makes you important as the chosen people is going to be taken away from you because you've rejected the one true, the cornerstone, right? Or you've rejected the stone. And so then it's going to become the corner. So these, you see, this starts to become incredibly offensive to these people because their mindset has been entrenched in the opposite of what Jesus is saying. And I'm just talking about this a little bit because I wanted to, I don't like that we just always throw the Pharisees and the scribes and the Jewish leaders under the bus. Like that they're just, because the reality is we're a lot like them in a lot of areas. Like we need to look at the humanity of them, and we need to look at how they got there. And we need to try to be more like the Nicodemus Pharisee than these guys, but recognize that they're all Pharisees and they all had this. And what world were they living in? And how did they get to a point where they could not accept these teachings to the point where they sought out and succeeded in killing the Son of Man? So that's all I want as we talk about this. That's kind of what I'm thinking about. How do we really understand the psyche and what led these guys to be where they are? Aaron, I saw your hand. Do you still have a comment?
It was kind of sort of along what you're saying, but I think it was kind of jumping to verse 18, which I don't want to do, so I'm going to wait.
Okay. All right. Very good. Any other comments on verse 16? All right. So verse 17, which we've had a fair amount of foreshadowing over. Let's look at that. We've already read it. Laura read for us Psalm 118:22, which is what this is a quote of. The question we had here was, how do you think those who first heard, how do you think the people who were there when Jesus told this parable in this story answered how do you think that they heard what he was saying? And how did they answer? So we're reading it with cross references in our Bibles, and probably not the first time that we've talked about this or looked at it in the Bible or heard about it in a sermon. So let's put ourselves in the minds of those who he's speaking to. When Jesus says, "What then does this text mean? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." How do you think the people who were listening related to that, and how do you think they answered that?
I like at the end of verse 16, where it says, when they heard it, they said, my version says, "May it never be." Or some versions say, "God forbid, may it never be." But then Jesus is like, it's happening. You're doing it. And then he quotes the Old Testament, which there's, those who are leaders in the church should have known.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. I like that. Phyllis.
Well, just to briefly go back to 16, when they heard it, they said, "Certainly not," or "God forbid," like Laura was talking about. They really didn't think that God would ever kill them. They thought they were doing everything so right, mostly because it was their laws that they were doing so right. You know, they had all these traditions and everything that took the place of some of the commandments in a way. So they really didn't think that that would ever happen. And now they're hearing that everything could be crashing down. Everything they built, that whole way of living, and them being, you know, like, let's say it'd be like a church, the whole leadership of the church, you know, the elders, the deacons, the pastor, who's most important and all that kind of thing, that all of that's changing. All of that's going to come crashing down because they didn't do it the right way. I get back to the cornerstone being the first thing, everything has to be laid on. They've not laid all of their faith on the cornerstone. They've done their own thing. So now they're afraid that they're going to be, you know, that they're going to be, I guess, accosted by the people, because now that the people will come and they will be the ones who are in control rather than this hierarchy that they've set up of how that the faith should go. So it's like that will fall. And they really never thought that would come. They just thought they were beyond that.
Yeah. That's, I mean, you're tapping into a really important part of this psyche, right? That not only had they gotten to a place where they find what he's saying offensive, it's like completely unreasonable what he's suggesting to them. And it's so interesting, right? That basically selfishness, they've made their own rules. A lot of them, they set up their own type of governance. This isn't all most of it's not from the Torah. Most of it they've invented much later, and they've convinced themselves that that's God's will. So let's think about that for a moment. You know, how does that work? Where we convince ourselves that the things that we've created and the things that we've done, our own will, when we have the audacity to assume that that's God's will. I mean, what do you think about that? How does one end up there? How does one not end up there? Sarah.
Well, I don't know. I guess, you know, you get an opinion in your mind that you are so high and mighty that, you know, nobody can question you. Nobody can come against you. And then you can come out and basically just say, well, yeah, we see these laws, we see all these things, but, you know, we're so wonderful, we're so terrific. We're gonna just decide, you know, what we can listen to and what we can get rid of. And, you know, we're gonna do our own thing because we're just so fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Do you all find this kind of a challenging thing to dissect? I mean, I do a little bit because God isn't like visible. I'm not, Erin is here at my house and she says she's going to do something and she does it there. I see, I hear there, it's right. Like I've witnessed that. If I ask her opinion on something or what she thinks I should do, she'll tell me. And because I've seen her actions and because I'm continuing to see her actions, and also I heard her audibly, you know, it seems like I'm not going to question that. But I sense that we struggle a bit with the idea of knowing what is our will and what is God's will, right? Because we're like, wait, was that the Spirit? Was that God? leading me that way? Or was that coincidence? Or was that, deception? Or was that, I've met people who are Christians who are, the whole paralysis by analysis, so concerned about making sure that they don't assume it's their own will. They can't do anything. I mean, like they're at the cash register and there's like some sort of discrepancy with a penny or something. I mean, this was shared in a small group that I had years ago. Totally paralyzed. Could not figure out how, because didn't feel that there was a clear answer of what God was doing in that moment and what needed to happen, and couldn't just move forward. Like there has to be a certain amount of trust in God that he's accepted our brokenness. He's using our, he's chosen clay pots, right? Broken vessels that we are, and that he's chosen to use us. So there has to be a certain trust that he knows the risks involved, but not with any arrogance, right? We would never want to be assuming like that, well, because God knows what he's getting into, I'm just going to do whatever and it's going to be fine, right? There's a really fine balance here, I think. And it's a really tricky balance because it's different in each person's life. And ultimately it's completely this whole thing is relational. Like it has to be like, we have to just kind of know who God is and he needs to know who we are. And we need to feel that he knows who we are. And we need to feel that we know who he is so that we feel comfortable in how things are going. And sometimes we're going to assume something that was not God's will. So I think this is the defining moment. Not that we're never going to, but that in that moment when we assume something and we realize later it was not God's will, do we react arrogantly and maintain our position once we've realized it wasn't God's will? Or do we in that moment then apologize and then seek to do better the next time? See, I think that's why this is a tricky thing, because ultimately that's the moment that is defining. I don't think it's always the moment of like, is this God's will or is this not? Sometimes it is clear. And like we see with the Jewish leaders here, blatant rejection of something incredibly obvious right in front of their face. But leading up to that point, there were a bunch of small decisions that had happened in their life and in the life of their parents and their grandparents that had led them to this place where they're able to so blatantly reject something so obvious. And it's those decisions I'm talking about that I think are so fundamental in our Christian experience, because we are going to sometimes think that something is God's will and it's our will, but we should realize sooner than later that that was not the case. And when that happens, instead of us using that as a way to support our own selfish agendas, we repent of it, right? So I think that that's the key thing is recognizing that and not shying away from questioning, whose leading are we following, our own or God's, but also not being paralyzed by it. We're living, breathing organisms in a sinful world. There has to be a certain amount of like trust in God. And also, he is faithful, and he's trusting us. And I think that's why it's a big deal when we break his trust. And I don't think we think about that, right? Why would God trust sinners or imperfect? He knows exactly what needs to happen, right? But it's a relationship. There is a certain amount of trust going both ways. I mean, him and Peter, you look at that relationship, there was trust, even though Peter was getting it wrong and getting it wrong and getting it wrong again and getting it really wrong. Like Jesus is still there's a certain expectation of Peter was his friend and his disciple and someone he knew and someone who he expected to make good choices. And when he didn't make good choices, there were sometimes some more difficult conversations, get thee behind me, Satan, being probably the most poignant one. But there was also always an opportunity to just move forward and try to do better next time. And so I think that there's a real lesson in that. And I just wanted to take a moment to kind of look at that, because this is the part of this whole, what am I trying to say? For me, it's really easy to just point the finger at these scribes and Pharisees. And this is a very cathartic moment. They now, I mean, they've already established they want to kill Jesus. They did that in Luke chapter 19. We read that in verse 47. We've read it sooner than that as well. But now, I mean, it's really culminating. And yet, how did they get there? What caused them? They're religious people. What caused them to be able to reject all these things to the point that they reject the stone? Now, let's get back to the topic at hand, because I did a little mini sermon there. My apologies for that. Let's talk about this cornerstone a bit and the stone. So there is a perspective that's been suggested that I've read in a few places that when they built Solomon's temple, and some of you may have heard this, that the stones were all hewn at the quarry, not on site. That means that the only thing that happened on site was the building of the temple. Like the stones, once they arrived, and because I think there was an idea that was supposed to represent how divine it was and affected by the spirit and things like that. And apparently there was like this super big stone that was somewhat of an odd shape, like really massive, large, that arrived. And they didn't have a place for it. And they had set other stones into this, what they call the keystone, the stone where the foundation, like you have to build off of a point. And so the stone that they were building off of, and it seems that the other stones continued to fail, would fracture, crush, were not supporting the structure. And apparently at some point, like and it becomes like recognized that this is an odd shape and an odd spot, and the other stones are failing, to where the builders realize they have this other really big stone that they had set off to the side because it was such a weird shape they didn't know what to do with it, and that stone they then eventually move in, and that becomes their cornerstone. And it does not fail, and even in its odd shape and what they thought wasn't appropriate and they thought was not good, actually becomes the cornerstone of Solomon's temple. Now, I didn't heavily research that to know. I mean, one writer who writes it is a writer I trust greatly, but I also found it in a couple other places. So I throw it out there for something to consider. If that's the case, and if that story was carried on, then that means that the people Jesus is talking to have this understanding of the cornerstone in regard to the temple, which of course is there is another parable here, right? As somebody suggested, what does the cornerstone represent? What is, this idea of the temple? We could have fun with that too. So this cornerstone that was put in, that does not fail, and that ultimately Solomon's temple was built upon, that they would be thinking about that. There's a couple of other verses I want to read too that I think were fresh on their mind. Of course, Psalm 118:22 we all talked about earlier. Let's also look at Isaiah 8:13-15. Who is going to look that up for us? Isaiah 8:13-15. I got another one too. Somebody grab Isaiah 8. Show me a hand. Thanks, Phyllis. How about Isaiah 28:16? Who's going to grab that one? Thanks, James. So we're going to, this is the prophet Isaiah. We know that they would read the scrolls of Isaiah because Jesus read from the scroll. He read from Isaiah, what we now call chapter 60, when he was in the temple in Nazareth at the very beginning of his ministry, the synagogue, I should say. So let's hear some other readings relating to this idea. Phyllis, Isaiah 8, please.
Okay, is that 13-18?
13-15.
15, okay, thanks. Again, this is the New King James. The Lord of hosts, him you shall hallow. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. He will be as a sanctuary, but a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel as a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many among them shall stumble. They shall fall and be broken, be snared and taken.
So when we look at verse 18 in Luke 20, everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. It will crush anyone on whom it falls. These are the chief priests. These are the scribes and the Pharisees, you know, people who understood the law, the religious law and the scriptures. They were most certainly aware of that passage in Isaiah. And so when Jesus states what he's stating, that isn't a new concept. And I mean, it's obvious that they draw the conclusion of what he means, because they have a correlation here, that he's connecting this with the teachings in the prophet Isaiah. James, would you read verse 28, 16 for us? Chapter 28, verse 16.
Sorry, reading from the New Living Translation. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I am placing a foundation stone in Jerusalem, a firm and tested stone. It is a precious cornerstone that is safe to build on. Whoever believes need never be shaken.
So what is that telling us in that passage? What's God saying there through Isaiah? Aaron.
That this stone is stable.
Mm-hmm. Do you pick up anything else there?
It's placed by God,
Mm-hmm.
so it's bound to be perfect stone.
Mm-hmm.
Right. A precious cornerstone. That's an interesting adjective. A sure foundation. So it's unwavering. It will not, it won't fail. One who trusts will not panic. So this, I believe that this is also interesting. If you read this whole chapter, or at least this whole section, this entire prophetic bit is about judgment on corrupt rulers and priests and prophets. So, you know, not coincidence that Jesus is referencing this. Sure, he's quoting Psalm 118, but the connection with Isaiah 28 is very visible. And not just in that Jesus saying, I am the cornerstone that you're rejecting, just like the builders in Solomon's day rejected, but also is saying, you know, Isaiah talks about this. And when he does, it's about corrupt religious leaders, AKA you guys. Right? I mean, that's what's going on here. It seems like. Phyllis.
I think it's also interesting in Isaiah 28:16, the very last phrase says, whoever believes that this is a cornerstone that God has laid will not act hastily. And I think that that's kind of an interesting phrase, given that in the present with Luke, that they are thinking of acting hastily and killing Jesus. So that might be another part of it, but I had not thought of that before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. Any other thoughts on this? Any other thoughts on what you think the audience was? What answer do you think they were coming up with in their minds when he says, what then does this text mean? What do you think they were answering in their own minds about this? doesn't give a chance for them to answer, or it's not recorded. Probably they didn't answer. I mean, if they had an answer, it's not one that they would be willing to say out loud because it would be incriminating, I'm sure. Any ideas what you think they, or just what you think they were thinking? All right. Yeah, Aaron.
I don't know if they were really thinking this or not, but it's just made me think of like what you guys were talking about earlier about like the mindset of the like what kind of mindset they the leaders had to like reject Jesus and like to come to the point where they just wouldn't change their mind about him. And like reading this verse in like this little passage here from 16 to 18, and kind of like what Phyllis was talking about with like building their faith on certain foundations. Like it kind of made me think of like that maybe like they built their like identity on this foundation too, like of being like maybe leaders in the church or like or just like the thoughts they had about God, like and in themselves. And what these things Jesus is saying, like this parable is like kind of shaking up like their, you know, their foundation that they've built, like their identity or their faith on. And like perhaps. And so it kind of made me think of like verse 18 as like if we don't let like our like these false foundations that we built like certain aspects of ourselves on like be broken by Jesus, then like that it's going to be like turned to powder, it's going to be crushed. And so there's no way to like, in my mind, I don't know if like I'm interpreting this right or not, but you can't fix like something that's powder. Like you can't like put it back together. But like if something's broken like in pieces, you can still like put it, you know, you can rearrange them and make it something different, or you can like, you know, put it back together in some way. And so I don't know if that's what 18 is talking about, like that we need to, as well as like the leaders in the context here, like we need to let like Jesus break down like these things that we've built ourselves on, like these identity, like our identity maybe, or our faith on, that aren't right, like that aren't truths, and like let him, you know, break that up. And even if it like makes us like feel like our world's like crashing down, you know, or whatever, like don't like resist it, which is hard. I'm, you know, like because otherwise it's just like going to like it's going to destroy us, basically, I think is what it's saying. So I don't know.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I mean, that's in line with the whole idea of like the refiner's fire. We always speak about that in more like maybe positive context. The fire burns out the impurities. That's the process we go through. Sanctification, of standing in God's holiness, is that the impurities be purged out. The fire, you know, burn those things and leave, you know, pure gold or pure or what, you know, whatever the case may be, a pure metal or some sort of precious metal that's been purified through the fire process. And I think, you know, the connection with that, kind of what you're talking about with like, you know, the clay model or the stone model, powder versus pieces and things like that, is that the powder is to me a metaphor for this, for a situation where there is no precious metal, where someone has resisted God to the point of when they go through the refining fire, they're just consumed. That the refiner's fire, for those who allow it to do what it's meant to do, it will reduce us to the goodness that is God in us. But if we've completely expelled God from every aspect of our life, then all that fire does is consume everything else. and there is no goodness. So I find there to be a parallel there, and it's interesting because we talk about the fire in one context, and this is obviously much more like a judgment kind of context of like crushed to powder, there's nothing left. But I think they're both connected in that way. Phyllis.
Yeah, I like that analogy because I'm thinking that, we're told that in this world we will have tribulation. We know that we're going to have tribulation. We know things are going to happen to us. And I know that, and I don't know what verse it's in, but I know that we're told that, we should welcome this tribulation because of what you're talking about. Because we know that with that tribulation, it comes an opportunity for us to get closer to God. Because if we allow it to do what it's supposed to do, then it is an opportunity. But I think that I just thought of that when I was listening to what you were saying.
Yeah, you might be thinking, I think Paul speaks about something that such and such leads to character, or endurance, which leads to character, that there's these fruitful things that can come out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're not if we don't have our orientation in the right direction, that the positives don't come out of it.
Right.
Yeah. Great thoughts, great conversation here. Let's just look at the last verse 19. What is the reaction from the Jewish leaders after Jesus has said all of this?
They wanted to arrest him.
Yep. Aaron?
It looks like they felt like he was speaking against them through the parable, and it seems also that they were afraid the people could see that too, and like that the people were thinking the same thing, like, oh, this is against them, like, so they were getting like, probably really mad about that as well. Like when they thought that the people like were going to be like maybe changing their opinion of them or looking down on them, maybe perhaps.
So I take a moment here. I skipped over this for time, but this brings, I'm gonna come to this. So if they had, well, before I say that, so Matthew records the same parable, and there's a couple of extra verses that I think are particularly enlightening in Matthew 21. And so we are verses 33 onward in Matthew 21. And if we look at a couple of them, let's look at 40 to 41. So in Luke records this little dialogue as if Jesus is saying the whole thing. So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. That's what Luke says. And the way the quotes end in Luke, it's as if Jesus is like putting forth a rhetorical question and answering the question himself. If we look at the way Matthew records it, now when the owner of the vineyard comes, this is verse 40 of Matthew 21, what will he do to those tenants? End of quote. And now the people he's talking to, the Jewish leaders, they said to him, he will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the harvest time. So in Matthew's record, we see them actually self-condemnation. And I think that they didn't realize that after they said it. And ultimately, I think that's what affects part of the reaction in verse 46 of Matthew, verse 19 of Luke 20, is that they had already condemned themselves once. And they knew that if they arrested Jesus, they were going to fulfill the prophecy he had just said. And it was going to be blatant obvious to everyone around that they were indeed doing exactly what Isaiah prophesied, what Psalm 118 says, and that they were indeed killing the Messiah. But if they wait a little bit, maybe the people won't remember. It's really an awful scene here. I mean, this is evil. This is just, my goodness, what these guys are doing for this agenda that they have, when all they need to do is like say, I'm sorry, forgive me. I mean, it's like such an easy solution and yet so far out of reach for them. And so now it's all like, it's just all politics is what it is. Like, well, if we try to kill him right now, then we are definitely the bad guys because of what he just said. And then we become, but if we wait, and if we, it's just, my goodness, so crazy. Aaron.
What you're saying too, that makes sense for why God says that pride is the most deadliest, I think it's the deadliest sin, or because like you just won't, like if I have pride about like saying no, I'm sorry, or admitting I'm wrong, then I just won't, like, I will never do it. Like I just won't risk that. And then it's like, that's going to like harden me even more in my, stance of like what I'm doing or whatever. So it's like basically you're making it so you can't or won't like change or admit you're wrong at all. Like, and you'll do anything to like not have people see that like you're in the wrong.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yep. It's exactly how I feel. That's what I think the key lesson here is. I mean, there is one more like maybe literal lesson, which is that the Jewish leadership was going to reject the Messiah. Like the people of God were going to reject God and kill him. Even after he'd sent prophet, they were going to reject prophet. They had rejected prophets, and then this parable is a bit of a prophecy that they're going to kill the Messiah. But I think there's also a deeper lesson that's not just prophetic, but that's actually like practical Christianity. And that has to do with like, if you dig deep here, this is really about the danger of pride and the danger of following ourselves and not God, and convincing ourselves that our way is God's way, which is like, pride on steroids, ego on steroids. So I think that's exactly right, Aaron. I think that's a great message to this. All right, we got a couple of questions to let's see if we can connect this to our lives a little bit. We've had some of that already today, a little different format in our discussion, but I want to ask you all, how do well, let's start with this. We could talk about people in general. If you want to speak from your own experience, that's fine too. But how do people in general these days, we're not in a theocracy anymore. We're not talking about this chosen nation that has the Messiah there in human form. So how do people these days reject Jesus without even knowing what they're doing? And this is not a point the finger exercise, but like an understanding what's happening around us. Phyllis.
I think that they follow even in the church, I think they follow the rules and the traditions without looking at what Jesus is really wanting from them or us. So they don't realize that they're not even following God, because they're just not acting like Jesus would act in situations. They're still very much very judgmental, very much, well, I mean, they're really judgmental. In this case, they thought everybody but them was not going to go to heaven, was not going to be seeing the New Jerusalem. So I think we can do it that way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anyone else? There's some ways that people reject Jesus without even knowing it. Sarah.
I think a lot of times these days, we tend to put, important people that we think are important on pedestals. And it's like whatever they say, whatever falls from their lips is like gospel. And we don't stop and think, hey, these people are just humans. They're just sinners like we are. They're not perfect. They're not God. And we forget that and we follow them instead of God. And it's kind of sad.
Yeah. Yeah, I was talking with my mom last night about they're getting a new pastor. And so it was like they're expecting all these people to show up who don't usually show up or haven't been for some time. That's what people do when you get a new pastor. And we were talking about like how it makes no sense. Like this kind of celebrity status we assign, and you've heard me say this before, that, in the New Testament, the word for pastor and elder is the same word. And, in our modern environment, it's really, I mean, there's some issue of responsibilities, I guess, but really it's just a difference of like, one is paid and able to do this full time, right? Give their life full time to this. And the others do it as lay people, is not as their vocation. But the idea that there's like this like superiority or this kind of celebrity status that we assign. And in my experience, most pastors don't really want that, but like congregations put it on them, right? And then we end up, so people ultimately are showing up because they want to see like, is this a pastor I'm going to follow, or do I need to like say something and criticize them and get rid of them or something, right? This is ultimately what's a lot of people are thinking about. And it's a very dangerous place to be, because first of all, the pastor's not Jesus. So trying to treat that pastor the same way that the Jews are treating Jesus, like we have to be very careful about that. And it ultimately can cause us to that pastor might be in the role of a prophet in that situation of this parable. But because we don't like what they're saying or something, we reject them when that's the messenger that God has sent to help us, right? So when we do choose which of these leaders we're going to follow or not follow, we run the risk of sending away God's servant, beaten and bruised, right?
Mhm.
All right, so let's make it a little more personal in regards to this. Would anyone be willing to share a time that you recognized that you were rejecting Jesus? And how did you work through that? Ultimately, what came of that? When was a time? Now, this requires a really, fairly intense amount of self-awareness, right? Because we can't sugarcoat our past to be able to answer a question like this. All of us have rejected him at some point. So being aware of when that is, that I'm just saying it's not an easy question. So, we do have a hand here, Aaron. So let's hear from you.
A specific time I can think of is many years ago when I was harming myself. I came to realize that I was rejecting like basically Jesus' sacrifice, because I was like trying to, I guess, like there were many aspects of like why I was doing it, but one of them I think was, I really do think I was trying to like be like a punishment, I guess, of some sort, or like to make up for things that I thought I was doing that were wrong, like get rid of the guilt, of like, doing something or whatever. Instead of like asking Jesus for forgiveness, I was like, oh, well, let me just do this. And then this is, me saying I'm sorry or whatever, or getting rid of the guilt. But that's like, then I came to realize that's rejecting, that was me rejecting basically Jesus, like as my savior. Like I was basically trying to be my own savior to like, I guess atone for whatever, or like I don't really have words for it, but like I see it that way, like, some of it that way. Like there were other reasons why I did it as well, but that part of it, like I can see as like a rejection. And also like just straight up like not treating my body as God's temple, like by doing that. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, really appreciate that. Anyone else? want to speak to a time when you rejected Jesus and what came of that? And how did you work through that? Something I'm trying to work through, have been here for, I guess, a year and a half or so, is a couple years. I don't know, as you all know, like always very committed to the social justice part of the gospel, and this is the fast I choose. And just trying to grow by serving people that sometimes seem unservable and sometimes are make it very difficult to serve even. I mean, that's part of the Jesus life. But, there's also a lot of people who take advantage of those situations, and it's very tiring. We've talked about that a little bit in our studies in past, emotionally taxing and things. And, whether I intentionally have or not, I think I've created some defense mechanisms just from doing a lot of that kind of what I call compassion ministry. So I think I've actually missed some opportunities because I've become a little too cynical in that, from those experiences and from that, kind of trying to, create a certain amount of boundaries, which aren't bad. Healthy boundaries are good, but I'm a sinful human being, and I can take healthy boundaries, and then I can find, oh, well, I'm a little more comfortable if those boundaries are a little closer, right? So I think I've, the Bible says that much as you've done to the least of these, you've done it to me. I think I've rejected Jesus in a few opportunities that have passed by because of my own cynical view and some of the things that had happened with some different people, or some people who call my phone all the time, but only for the same thing in certain situations that I know aren't true. So, I have to be careful not to let those situations affect my ability to serve people who are in my path. So it's a hard thing for me to say out loud, but something I'm trying to figure out and work through. Anyone else? Time you've rejected Jesus? How did it work out? How did you work through it? Sarah?
I think there was this time when I was trying to decide whether I was Christian or whether I was Jewish. And I didn't know which way to go. And I didn't know if I should keep them separate. Should I be one or the other? I didn't know which camp I wanted to be in. And then I guess I realized that I didn't have to keep them separate. I could be both. I think they could somehow live in harmony. Because sometimes, somebody, will ask me, my religion or something, what are you? I'm like, well, I'm Jewish. Either, because, my father was Jewish, my mother was, I think, Catholic. And some people would say, well, then you're Catholic or you're Jewish. And I was like, okay, I had identity problem. I didn't know which way I wanted to go. And I'm like, well, I could be both. I don't have to, Jesus is not going to reject me if I say I'm Christian. He's not going to reject me if I say I'm Jewish. He's going to say, I love you no matter what you are. So I'm, I'm like, okay, I don't have to pick sides. I can be both and be happy.
Amen. Yeah, Jesus Christ was a Jew.
Right.
And all of his disciples at that time were Jews. Paul was a Jew.
Yeah.
Yeah. So most of the early church there in the book of Acts, as we read it, a lot of them were Jewish.
Yeah.
Not all. So yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone's sharing time and discussion and the things you've had to offer today. I think the stories are going to keep getting a little more intense. We have a couple of interesting teachings coming up. One thing that I need to mention is we are not meeting next week on October 9th. We are not. We would love to invite all of you to come to the Sarasota Seventh-day Adventist Church at 11 a.m., where we are hosting a worship gathering there with them and a guest speaker, Dustin Hall, who is quite an expert and very experienced in urban ministry. He's going to be speaking about urban ministry. And then bring a sack lunch for yourself or your family, and stay by for an urban ministry workshop afterwards with Dustin Hall.
That's October 9th, 2021.
Right, October. Yeah, thank you very much for the year, since some of you might be watching this a year from now. So 2021 is what we're talking about, October 9th. We'd like to invite you to come to that. Know that we will not be here, but we will pick up after that with two interesting teachings that I think are going to be a lot of fun. And from there, I imagine we will have many more discussions similar to today as this showdown between the Jewish leaders and Jesus kind of intensifies and ultimately culminates as we near the end of the book of Luke. Thank you all for joining us. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer as we close out. Heavenly Father, thank you for this message. It's dark and scary, we could say, as it is. And we thank you for including this in Scripture. The gospel writers wrote this down for us to read. I just pray, Lord, that you would, for myself, for everyone here on the study and those watching, that you would help us to not just point fingers at the religious leaders, but to learn from this story to how to protect ourselves from letting our selfishness and our ego and our greed and our pride ever lead us to a place that we would reject you in the way that they did. We all have rejected you in some way, some small way or some big way. Lord, we love that. We just love you so much for forgiving us and picking us back up where we dropped off. We pray, Lord, that you would help us not to reject you anymore, that we would just grow closer and closer. And Lord, please do protect us from ever becoming so prideful that we could ever be in a situation as these people were. They would that they killed you in the name of their faith, in the name of goodness. We just want to be, what am I trying to say here? We just want to be a manifestation of the love that you are and that you exhibit, and that we would be completely unconditional in loving those around us, and that we would be completely committed to your cause and completely compassionate and empathetic to those around us in all things, and that we would not ever put ourselves before others, and definitely not before you. So we ask this in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in 2 weeks at 4:00 Eastern Daylight Time, the same social media channels and here on Zoom. Have a great week. Take care.